Picture this, a Gothic Revival castle perched on the cliffs above the Hudson River, its limestone towers catching the late afternoon sun, its manicured lawns rolling down toward the water where steamboats once carried America's fortune-makers between New York City and their country retreats, and inside those ornate halls, behind those stained glass windows imported from Europe, the ghost of one of America's most ruthless and brilliant robber barons still lingers, whispering secrets of manipulation, greed, innovation, and the staggering human cost of building an empire on rails of steel. This is Lyndhurst, and this is the story they don't tell you in the guidebooks, the story of how Jay Gould, the man once called the most hated financier in America, a wizard of Wall Street who could manipulate stock prices with a telegram and destroy competitors with a signature, came to possess this fairy tale mansion, and how the castle itself became both a fortress against public hatred and a monument to the dark alchemy that transformed American labor, land, and law into personal wealth so vast it defied comprehension. But before we meet Gould, before we understand the railroad gold that built Lyndhurst's fortune, we must first meet the man who dreamed this castle into existence, General William Paulding, a former New York City mayor whose own ambitions and family tragedies set the stage for everything that followed. In 1838, when Paulding purchased the land in Tarrytown, the Hudson River Valley was already establishing itself as America's Rhine, a picturesque corridor where the newly wealthy could escape the stench and chaos of Manhattan streets, and Paulding, with his distinguished military service and political connections, wanted a country seat that would announce his arrival among America's emerging aristocracy. So he hired Alexander Jackson Davis, the era's preeminent architect of the Gothic Revival style, and together they conjured something extraordinary. Not a mere house but a statement in stone, a castle with asymmetrical towers, pointed arch windows, elaborate tracery, and a romantic silhouette that seemed lifted from Walter Scott's novels or the medieval landscapes then captivating American imaginations, and Davis, working in a style he called rural Gothic, designed Lyndhurst to harmonize with its natural setting, the building appearing to grow organically from the clifftop, its warm gray limestone contrasting beautifully with the river and sky beyond, its interiors featuring soaring ceilings, ornate plasterwork, carved woodwork, and spaces designed for both grand entertaining and intimate family life. But Paulding's dream was complicated by the same forces reshaping all of America, the relentless expansion of industry, the rise of new fortunes that made old merchant wealth look quaint, and the social upheavals that came with rapid economic transformation, and by 1864, facing financial pressures common to many of the old elite, the Paulding family sold Lyndhurst to George Merritt, a successful merchant who immediately expanded the estate, doubling the house's size with a new north wing, adding a massive tower that became the castle's signature feature, enlarging the grounds, building an elaborate greenhouse complex designed by the renowned landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted's associate, and essentially transforming Lyndhurst from a substantial villa into a genuine mansion suitable for America's Gilded Age. Yet even as Merritt invested hundreds of thousands of dollars into his Gothic paradise, even as he filled it with art and furniture befitting a merchant prince, he too would discover that wealth in America had become a game of scale, speed, and ruthlessness that traditional businessmen could scarcely comprehend, because while merchants like Merritt made their fortunes through patient trade and careful accumulation, a new breed of capitalist was emerging, men who understood that the real money wasn't in making things or selling things but in controlling the systems through which things moved, the railroads, telegraphs, and financial markets that were literally rewiring American economic life, and no one embodied this new ruthless genius better than Jay Gould, born Jason Gould in 1836 to a desperately poor farming family in the Catskill Mountains of New York, a sickly child whose small stature and frail health seemed to doom him to obscurity, whose formal education ended at a rural academy but whose fierce intelligence and photographic memory allowed him to teach himself surveying, mathematics, and the intricate workings of corporate law and finance, who by his early 20s had already shown the pattern that would define his career, partnering with others to start ventures, learning everything about the business, then maneuvering his partners out through legal technicalities and ruthless financial manipulation, accumulating capital not through innovation or hard work but through what his enemies called theft and what he called superior strategy. And wasn't this the essential question that would haunt American capitalism for generations? Where exactly is the line between business acumen and criminal behavior, between fair competition and predatory manipulation, between building wealth and stealing it, and who gets to decide where that line falls? Judges appointed by politicians funded by the very men they're supposed to regulate, newspapers owned by rival financiers pursuing their own vendettas, or the workers and small investors whose savings and labor get consumed in these titanic battles between millionaires. By the late 1860s, Gould had identified the leverage point that would make him spectacularly wealthy: railroad stocks, not the actual railroads themselves, not the prosaic business of moving freight and passengers, but the abstract financial instruments that represented ownership, shares that could be bought, sold, manipulated, watered down, consolidated, and played like cards in a high-stakes game where Gould always seemed to know what everyone else was holding, and his first major score came with the Erie Railroad, where along with partners James Fisk and Boss Tweed, yes, the same Tweed whose political machine ran New York City as a personal fiefdom, Gould fought a spectacular financial war against Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore himself, for control of one of the Northeast's most important rail lines, and the Erie War, as it became known, featured literally everything that would come to symbolize Gilded Age corruption, the mass printing of fraudulent stock certificates to dilute Vanderbilt's holdings, the bribing of judges to issue contradictory injunctions, Gould and Fisk fleeing across the Hudson River to New Jersey with bags of cash to escape arrest, the buying of state legislators wholesale, literally bringing suitcases filled with money to Albany and purchasing laws like groceries, and finally a settlement where everyone involved made millions while the railroad itself staggered under massive new debt and the small shareholders saw their investments evaporate. But if you were watching from the Catskills farmhouse where Gould grew up, didn't this look exactly like success, like a poor boy using his wits to beat the richest men in America at their own game? And if you were one of the Erie Railroad workers whose wages were cut to service the debt from Gould's stock manipulations, didn't this look exactly like theft, like your labor being stolen to fund someone else's mansion? What made Gould particularly dangerous, particularly brilliant, was his complete integration of information, finance, and transportation. He understood that whoever controlled the telegraph lines controlled the flow of market information, and whoever controlled that flow could always be seconds ahead of everyone else, could know about price changes, crop failures, political decisions, and competitor moves before anyone else, turning that information into instant profit. And this is why Gould systematically gained control of Western Union Telegraph, not because he cared about the communications business but because it gave him the ultimate insider trading advantage, the ability to literally read his competitors' telegrams and trade on information that was supposed to be private. And yes, this was probably illegal even then, but who exactly was going to stop him when he could hire better lawyers than the government, when he could buy legislators, when he could ruin any newspaper that criticized him by manipulating the stock of its parent company? His greatest coup, and the source of the immense fortune that would eventually allow him to purchase Lyndhurst, came through his systematic conquest of Western railroads, particularly the Union Pacific. And this story reveals not just Gould's methods but the entire corrupt system that made Gilded Age fortunes possible, because the Union Pacific had been built with massive federal subsidies, land grants that gave the railroad company millions of acres of public land, government bonds, and monopoly rights across vast territories, all supposedly to serve the public interest by connecting the continent. But by the time Gould seized control in 1874, the railroad had already been looted once by its founders through the Credit Mobilier scandal, a scheme where insiders created a construction company, hired themselves, grossly overcharged the railroad they supposedly served, and distributed the profits and stock to friendly congressmen to prevent investigation. And rather than reform this corruption, Gould perfected it, using his controlling stake to issue new stock that diluted other shareholders, to manipulate the company's reported earnings to move the stock price up or down as suited his trading position, to extract management fees and consulting payments, to award contracts to his own subsidiary companies, and most ingeniously, to use the Union Pacific's treasury to buy stock in competing lines, then deliberately mismanage those competitors to benefit his primary holdings, creating a personal railroad empire that stretched across the American West and represented not the triumph of free enterprise but the capture of public infrastructure for private profit. The scale of wealth this generated is almost impossible to comprehend in modern terms, By the early 1880s, Jay Gould's personal fortune was estimated at over $70 million, which doesn't sound impressive until you realize that this represented roughly 1% of America's entire gross domestic product, meaning Gould personally controlled as much wealth as tens of thousands of average families combined, and this concentration wasn't just morally offensive to many Americans, though it certainly was that. It was also economically dangerous because Gould's machinations destabilized markets, his sudden moves could trigger panics, his battles with other railroad titans like Vanderbilt and Huntington created uncertainty that paralyzed business planning, and his stranglehold on telegraph communications meant he could essentially manipulate information flows across the entire country. Yet somehow this man, who was regularly burned in effigy by striking railroad workers, whose name was synonymous with corporate evil in newspaper editorials, who received death threats so regularly that he employed bodyguards and armed his home like a fortress, somehow this man decided that what he really needed was not more money, he already had more than he could ever spend, but respectability, acceptance, a place among the old established families who looked down on him as a jumped-up thief regardless of his wealth. And this is where Lyndhurst enters the story, because in 1880, Jay Gould purchased the Gothic Castle from George Merritt for $150,000, a significant sum but pocket change for Gould, and immediately began transforming it from a successful merchant's showplace into a robber baron's fortress, expanding the estate to over 500 acres, improving the already impressive greenhouse to create one of America's finest private conservatories, filled with rare orchids that cost more than a working man's annual salary, installing the latest technologies including telephone connections directly to his Wall Street office and private telegraph lines so he could manipulate markets from his pastoral retreat, building extensive servant quarters because his new lifestyle required an army of invisible workers, gardeners, grooms, housekeepers, maids, cooks, laundresses, footmen, coachmen, and personal secretaries, to maintain the illusion of effortless elegance that the estate projected. But here's where the story gets interesting, where the darkness that permeates every robber baron mansion really shows itself, because while Gould was transforming Lyndhurst into his family refuge, the very workers whose labor he had exploited to build his fortune were organizing against him, and in 1885, his railroad workers launched massive strikes against the Union Pacific and Missouri Pacific systems, strikes that paralyzed commerce across the Southwest, that turned violent when Gould hired Pinkerton agents and state militias to break the picket lines, that ended with workers beaten, arrested, blacklisted, their leaders imprisoned or run out of town, and through it all, Gould retreated to Lyndhurst, where he played with his children on manicured lawns maintained by low-wage Irish and Italian immigrants, where he hosted elegant dinners served by liveried servants who earned a fraction of what his stock portfolio gained in an afternoon, where he cultivated his beloved orchids in heated greenhouses while men who had helped build his railroads wondered how they would feed their families through the winter after being fired for union activity, and the physical separation between Lyndhurst and the rest of America wasn't just geographical. The castle sat behind walls and gates, protected by guards, accessible only by private road, its beautiful Gothic architecture and riverside setting creating an almost mythical space that seemed to exist in a different universe than the industrial cities and agricultural towns where ordinary people struggled. It was psychological and moral, a separation that allowed men like Gould to live in extraordinary beauty and comfort while maintaining economic policies that ground others into poverty, and the question that echoes through those Gothic halls even now is this: did Gould not see the contradiction? Did he not understand that his orchids were watered with tears, or did he understand perfectly well and simply not care? Believing perhaps that he had earned his fortune through superior intelligence and that those who failed to rise had only themselves to blame, subscribing to the social Darwinism then popular among the wealthy, which conveniently reframed ruthless exploitation as natural selection and massive inequality as proof of meritocracy. What's particularly striking about Gould's years at Lyndhurst is how desperately he wanted his children to be accepted by the very society that despised him, how he tried to use the estate as a finishing school where his daughters could learn the manners and tastes of old money, where his sons could be groomed for lives as gentlemen rather than as financial pirates. And in this way Lyndhurst functioned much like Waddesdon Manor did for the Rothschilds, as defensive architecture, as a stage set for performing respectability, as a tool for social climbing that might allow the next generation to escape the stigma that clung to the fortune's origins, and to some extent this strategy worked, because after Jay Gould's death in 1892 from tuberculosis, that great democratic disease that killed rich and poor alike, reminding everyone that wealth could not ultimately protect you from biology, his children, particularly his daughter Helen, did manage to achieve a kind of social acceptance, Helen becoming a philanthropist and patron of the arts whose Gould name opened doors that had been closed to her father, though one wonders at what psychological cost, what burden of knowing that every beautiful thing around her, every advantage she enjoyed, had been purchased with other people's suffering, unless of course she had been so thoroughly insulated from those realities that she genuinely didn't know, genuinely believed the family mythology that her father had been a misunderstood genius persecuted by jealous rivals and a sensationalist press. Helen Gould, who inherited Lyndhurst and lived there until her death in 1938, represents a fascinating transitional figure. She devoted considerable wealth to charity, funding hospitals and libraries, supporting disaster relief, becoming known as a generous and civic-minded heiress, yet she never acknowledged the fundamental injustice of the system that had created her wealth, never questioned whether her father's fortune was rightfully his to bequeath, never considered that perhaps the workers he had exploited or the small shareholders he had ruined might have a better claim to those millions than she did, and this pattern, the second-generation philanthropist who launders dirty money through good works, would become perhaps the defining mechanism by which American capitalism reconciles its contradictions, allowing robber baron fortunes to transform into respectable foundations and endowments that bear the family name with honor, converting stolen wealth into social capital that can be passed down through generations, creating dynasties that persist long after everyone has forgotten or chosen to forget exactly how that original fortune was made, and you can see this process literally embodied in the architecture and grounds of Lyndhurst itself, which Helen slowly transformed from her father's fortress into something more genteel and accessible, hosting garden parties for local charities, allowing certain civic organizations to use the grounds, beginning the process that would eventually lead to the estate's preservation, yet always maintaining that fundamental separation between the beautiful castle and the world beyond its gates, always keeping the servants carefully invisible despite their essential role in maintaining the property, always presenting a curated version of history that emphasized aesthetic achievement and downplayed moral complexity. The estate passed to Helen's sister Anna, Duchess of Talleyrand-Perigord, because yes, Helen's sister had literally bought a French title through marriage, the ultimate symbol of American money-seeking European aristocratic legitimacy, and Anna maintained Lyndhurst until her death in 1961, after which the estate was bequeathed to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And this transition from private palace to public heritage site is where the real reckoning should have happened, where the full story should have been told, but of course it wasn't, not at first, because the trust was focused on preservation, on maintaining the architectural integrity and historical character of the estate, on presenting Lyndhurst as a masterpiece of Gothic Revival design and a window into Gilded Age elegance, and this emphasis, while not exactly wrong, had the effect of aestheticizing inequality, of turning systemic exploitation into a matter of tasteful interior design, of allowing visitors to admire the craftsmanship and beauty while ignoring the theft and suffering that paid for it all, and for decades this is how Lyndhurst was presented, as a fairy tale castle, a romantic retreat, a testament to American achievement and good taste, with Jay Gould's actual business practices relegated to brief mentions that usually framed him as a controversial financier or ruthless competitor, phrases that somehow managed to acknowledge wrongdoing while draining it of all moral weight, making mass exploitation sound like a personality quirk rather than a crime. But something shifted in recent decades, particularly as historians began seriously examining the human costs of the Gilded Age, as labor historians and economic historians started systematically documenting exactly how fortunes like Gould's were made, how many people were hurt, how the structures of inequality created then persist in modified forms today, and this scholarship gradually filtered into Lyndhurst's interpretation, with new exhibits exploring not just the Gould family's life but the lives of the servants who made that life possible, displaying photographs and records that revealed the rigid hierarchy below stairs, the long hours and low pay, the clear division between family spaces filled with art and servants' quarters that were cramped and stark, and more recently, attempting to grapple with Jay Gould himself not as a caricature, either the brilliant self-made man of libertarian mythology or the one-dimensional villain of labor history, but as a complex, deeply flawed human being whose exceptional intelligence and strategic genius were directed toward a system that rewarded manipulation and punished ethics, who lived in constant fear despite his wealth, who genuinely loved his children and seems to have been a devoted family man even while destroying other families through his business practices, who created beauty at Lyndhurst even as his corporate decisions created misery elsewhere, and the question the estate now poses, perhaps more powerfully than any textbook could, is this: how do we hold these contradictions in our minds simultaneously? How do we appreciate genuine aesthetic and architectural achievement while condemning the means by which it was funded? How do we understand that beautiful things can have ugly origins without either dismissing the beauty or excusing the ugliness, and what does it mean that we've preserved this place, that we maintain these grounds and conserve these buildings, that we allow people to visit and admire them? Is this a form of education and reckoning, or is it ultimately a celebration, a continued valorization of robber baron culture dressed up in the language of heritage preservation? Walking through Lyndhurst today, past the soaring Gothic windows and through the meticulously restored interiors, standing in the conservatory where Gould's orchids once bloomed and where descendants of those plants still flourish, looking out across the Hudson River from the same clifftop viewpoint where the Gould family watched steamboats pass, you can feel the weight of this contradiction. The way beauty and injustice intertwine so completely that they become inseparable, and perhaps this is the real lesson of places like Lyndhurst, the truth they can teach us if we're willing to learn, that there is no clean separation between the elegant and the exploitative, that the same society that produces Gothic castles and rare orchids also produces sweatshops and striker massacres, that these aren't separate phenomena but different faces of the same system. And that any honest reckoning with American history has to hold all of this complexity without flinching, without retreating into either pure condemnation that dismisses everything associated with the Gilded Age or nostalgic celebration that ignores the human costs, because the real danger isn't that we'll forget Jay Gould, history has already half forgotten him, his name no longer carrying the infamy it once did. The real danger is that we'll forget the system that made him possible. The specific legal structures and regulatory failures and political corruption that allowed one man to accumulate such disproportionate wealth and power, the way supposedly free markets were rigged from the start, how public resources were privatized, how labor was suppressed and competition was crushed not through superior performance but through manipulation and force, and if we forget these specifics, if we let them blur into a vague sense that the past was different or that everyone was corrupt back then so we can't really judge, then we lose the ability to see the same patterns playing out in our own time, the same concentration of wealth and power, the same capture of regulatory systems, the same conversion of public resources into private fortunes, the same rhetoric about market efficiency and meritocracy used to justify outcomes that look suspiciously like theft. The story of Lyndhurst is not ultimately about one castle or one family, it's about the architecture of inequality itself, the way power builds monuments to itself, the way wealth creates distance and separation, the way beauty can be used as both reward for the powerful and distraction for everyone else, and perhaps most importantly, about the long process of historical reckoning, the decades or centuries it takes for societies to fully confront what was done in the name of progress or free enterprise or economic development, to move from celebration to complication to something approaching honest assessment. And even now, even with more critical interpretations available, Lyndhurst remains a contested space where different narratives compete. Is it primarily a masterpiece of Gothic Revival architecture that must be preserved for its aesthetic significance? Is it a monument to Gilded Age excess that should be studied as a warning? Is it a piece of labor history that can teach us about class and inequality? Is it a family home with its own intimate stories of love and loss that transcend the economic circumstances of its creation? And the answer, frustratingly and truthfully, is that it's all of these things simultaneously, that any place with this much history and complexity resists simple categorization, which is precisely what makes it valuable, precisely why we should preserve it and study it and argue about what it means, because in those arguments we're really arguing about ourselves, about what we value, about what we're willing to acknowledge about our own society's structures of wealth and power. Consider the invisible hands that maintained Lyndhurst during its peak years, the dozens of servants whose labor created the illusion that beauty and elegance simply existed, that houses cleaned themselves, that meals appeared fully prepared, that gardens maintained their perfection without effort, that horses were always ready and carriages always polished and every detail was always perfect. And we know from surviving records and photographs that this required a massive staff working extraordinarily long hours for wages that were barely subsistence level, that servant life at a place like Lyndhurst meant being essentially on call all the time, living in cramped quarters in the attic or above the carriage house, having almost no privacy or personal time, being subject to dismissal for minor infractions or for displeasing the family in any way, yet also experiencing a kind of proximity to wealth that most Americans never saw, witnessing firsthand how the other half lived. Serving meals they could never afford to eat, handling objects worth more than they would earn in a lifetime, and what did this proximity do to them psychologically? Did it inspire them to work harder, believing that they too might somehow climb to such heights, or did it embitter them, making the contrast between their labor and the family's leisure unbearably stark, or did they simply accept it as the natural order of things, the way society had always been organized, some born to serve and others born to be served, because this is what power does most effectively, it naturalizes itself, makes inequality seem inevitable and even benevolent, frames the wealthy as job creators who generously provide employment rather than as beneficiaries of a system that requires some people to work themselves to exhaustion so others can live in castles. And you can still see this dynamic playing out today whenever anyone questions concentrated wealth, the immediate response being that rich people create jobs, that their consumption supports workers, that any attempt to redistribute wealth or limit accumulation would somehow hurt the very people it was meant to help, as if the only possible economic arrangement is one where vast inequality is preserved in the name of protecting employment. The Gould family's relationship with their servants reveals another layer of this complexity. By all accounts they were not deliberately cruel, they paid standard wages for the time and provided adequate housing by contemporary standards. Helen Gould was even known for a kind of paternalistic generosity towards staff members who fell ill or experienced family emergencies, yet this personal kindness coexisted with and did not challenge the fundamental exploitation of the system, the way that even good employers in an unjust system benefit from that injustice, the way that treating your own servants decently while supporting laws that suppressed unions and kept wages low across the economy is a kind of compartmentalization that allows you to feel virtuous while perpetuating harm, and this pattern too persists today. The executive who treats her personal assistant well while lobbying against minimum wage increases, the entrepreneur who prides himself on company culture while fighting labor regulations, the investor who funds homeless shelters while speculating on rental properties in ways that drive up housing costs, these contemporary forms of the same disconnect between individual kindness and systemic cruelty that characterize the Gilded Age, and perhaps what Lyndhurst can teach us, if we pay attention, is that personal virtue is not enough, that being nice to the people directly in front of you while maintaining structures that harm people at a distance is not actually ethical, that real justice requires examining and changing systems rather than just moderating their worst effects through charity. The environmental story of Lyndhurst adds yet another dimension to this reckoning. The estate's grounds, while beautiful, represent the same impulse to dominate and reshape nature that characterized Gilded Age industry, the same assumption that the natural world existed primarily as raw material to be exploited or as scenery to be arranged for human pleasure. And the creation of Lyndhurst's landscape required massive earth-moving, the importation of non-native species, the redirection of water flows, the construction of elaborate drainage systems, essentially the transformation of the Hudson Valley's native ecosystem into something that matched wealthy tastes shaped by European landscape traditions, and while the result is admittedly beautiful by conventional standards, we might ask what was lost in this transformation, what native species were displaced, what ecological relationships were disrupted, what this remaking of the landscape says about the same mentality that built continent-spanning railroads without regard for the indigenous peoples and ecosystems in their path, that clear-cut forests and strip-mined mountains and polluted rivers in the name of progress and profit. And yes, Lyndhurst's grounds are more benign than a strip mine, but don't they represent the same fundamental assumption, that the world exists for human use, specifically for wealthy humans' use, and that reshaping it to suit aesthetic preferences is not just acceptable but admirable? Evidence of refined taste and cultural sophistication. The contrast between Lyndhurst's carefully maintained beauty and the environmental devastation that Gould's railroads facilitated, the buffalo slaughters, the destruction of prairie ecosystems, the pollution of waterways, the poisoning of workers and communities near rail yards and industrial sites, is stark and instructive, showing how wealth allows you to surround yourself with beauty while externalizing the ugliness your fortune creates, to live in a Gothic paradise while the world you've profited from burns, and this too feels painfully contemporary, this ability of the wealthy to insulate themselves from climate change and environmental degradation, to build compounds in locations that will remain pleasant even as other regions become uninhabitable, to purchase clean air and water and food while others suffer the consequences of the economic system that created such concentrated wealth. And if Lyndhurst feels like a fairy tale, it's worth remembering that many fairy tales are actually quite dark, that castles in stories often belong to villains as much as heroes, that walls and moats and towers are defensive structures built by people who have reason to fear those they've wronged, and that the Gothic style itself, with its medievalism and dramatic shadows and romantic gloom, is the perfect aesthetic for this kind of guilty opulence, this beauty built on blood. By the early 20th century, even as the Gould daughters maintained Lyndhurst as a private retreat, the world that had made their father's fortune was changing in ways that made such naked exploitation harder to sustain. The progressive era brought new regulations, antitrust prosecutions, labor laws that limited child work and established basic safety standards, income taxes that at least nominally redistributed some wealth, and while these reforms were often limited and unevenly enforced and sometimes reversed, they represented a societal acknowledgement that the Gilded Age had gone too far, that unregulated capitalism had produced too much suffering and too much instability, that something had to change if the system was going to survive, and it's worth noting that these reforms came not primarily from the goodwill of the wealthy but from decades of labor organizing, from strikes and boycotts, from muckraking journalists who documented conditions in factories and tenements, from progressive politicians who faced down corporate power, from the constant pressure of people who refused to accept that their poverty was inevitable or their exploitation was justified, and yet even with these reforms, the fundamental structures of concentrated wealth and power remained intact. Families like the Goulds retained their fortunes, estates like Lyndhurst continued to operate with large staffs of low-wage workers, and the basic arrangement where some people lived in castles while others struggled to make rent never really changed. It just became slightly less brutal around the edges, slightly more regulated, with just enough concessions to prevent revolution while preserving privilege, and you can see this pattern repeating throughout American history, moments of crisis when inequality becomes so extreme that it threatens social stability, followed by reforms just substantial enough to take the pressure off, followed by decades of gradual erosion of those reforms as the wealthy use their resources to reshape laws and regulations in their favor, until eventually we arrive back at levels of inequality approaching the Gilded Age, with familiar justifications about innovation and job creation and market efficiency, as if we haven't already run this experiment and seen how it ends, as if Lyndhurst itself doesn't stand as evidence of where this road leads. The preservation of Lyndhurst by the National Trust represents both an opportunity and a danger, the opportunity to use this estate as an educational tool, a place where the full complexity of American economic history can be explored, where visitors can learn not just about Gothic architecture and Gilded Age aesthetics but about labor and capital, about how fortunes were made and what they cost, about the specific mechanisms of exploitation and the specific forms of resistance, about continuity and change between past and present, about how we got to where we are and what different choices might have led to different outcomes. But the danger is that preservation becomes celebration, that the National Trust status makes Lyndhurst feel like official history, like something we're meant to honor rather than learn from critically, that the emphasis on maintaining the estate's physical beauty and historical character overwhelms any attempt to grapple with its moral complexity, that it becomes another site for heritage tourism that treats the past as entertainment rather than as something that still shapes our present, that visitors come away with Instagram photos of a beautiful castle rather than uncomfortable questions about their own society structure, and avoiding this danger requires constant intentionality, requires interpretive programming that explicitly addresses these issues, requires hiring historians and educators who can tell the full story rather than just the sanitized version, requires a willingness to make wealthy donors and board members uncomfortable by acknowledging that places like Lyndhurst were built on systematic injustice, requires resisting the pressure to make history palatable or inspirational when sometimes it should be disturbing and cautionary. Jay Gould died in 1892, just 12 years after purchasing Lyndhurst, long enough to transform the estate but not long enough to achieve the social acceptance he craved, and the irony is that his efforts to buy respectability through a Gothic castle probably couldn't have worked regardless of how long he lived, because the old money families he was trying to impress understood correctly that he represented an existential threat to their world, that his methods of wealth accumulation, faster, more ruthless, more purely financial than the merchant and manufacturing fortunes of previous generations, represented a new phase of capitalism where connections and tradition mattered less than the ability to manipulate abstract instruments like stocks and bonds, where money made money with unprecedented speed and scale, where old certainties about property and value were dissolving into something more fluid and dangerous, and they were right to be frightened even as they were wrong to think they could remain separate from these forces, because within a generation their children would be marrying into robber baron families, their estates would be sustained by investments in the same corporations they'd once disdained, their own wealth would become entangled with exactly the financial systems that Gould had pioneered, proving that you can't maintain a bubble of respectability when the entire economy is transforming around you, that eventually everyone gets pulled into the dominant system whether they like it or not, and perhaps this is the ultimate lesson of Lyndhurst. Not that Jay Gould succeeded in buying acceptance but that the distinction he was trying to cross between old money and new money, between respectable and disreputable wealth, was always somewhat arbitrary, that all great fortunes have something suspect in their origins, that the only difference is how many generations have passed since the original theft or exploitation, how much time and charity and cultural patronage have been available to launder the reputation, how effectively the family has managed to tell a story about itself that emphasizes vision and achievement while minimizing violence and extraction, and if we accept this, if we stop treating the Gilded Age as an aberration and recognize it as a particularly naked example of how capitalism actually functions, then Lyndhurst becomes not a unique monument to exceptional wickedness but a representative example, a place that can teach us about the general case rather than the special one, a lens through which we can examine our own economic arrangements and ask whether they're really so different from what Jay Gould practiced, whether the distance between his railroad manipulations and contemporary private equity firms that buy companies, load them with debt, extract management fees, and leave them to collapse is as great as we'd like to believe, whether the line between his stock manipulation and contemporary high-frequency trading that exploits microsecond advantages is as clear as we pretend, whether his use of political connections to shape favorable laws is really so different from contemporary lobbying and campaign finance systems, whether his Pinkertons breaking strikes look so different from contemporary anti-union campaigns, and if the answer to these questions is uncomfortable, well, that's precisely why we need places like Lyndhurst, precisely why we need to tell the full, complicated, morally tangled story rather than the fairy tale version, because only by understanding how we got here can we imagine getting somewhere different. The castle stands today much as it did in Jay Gould's time, the Gothic towers still dramatic against the sky, the ground still meticulously maintained, the river still flowing past the cliff top with the same ancient rhythm, and there's something almost defiant about its persistence, the way these stone walls have outlasted the man who bought them, outlasted his daughters, outlasted the specific economic moment that made his fortune possible, survived into an era when railroad barons have been replaced by tech billionaires but the fundamental dynamics of wealth and power remain strangely familiar. And perhaps this is what Lyndhurst finally represents, not just one man's castle or one family's retreat but a kind of monument to capitalism's persistent patterns, to the way each generation produces its own robber barons who accumulate staggering wealth through morally questionable means, who face criticism and popular hostility, who try to buy respectability and establish dynasties, who build monuments to themselves that are genuinely beautiful even as they're morally compromised, and whose descendants eventually become philanthropists and cultural patrons whose fortunes are accepted as legitimate even though nothing about their origins has really been forgotten, just papered over with time and good works, and the question Lyndhurst poses to us now, in our own Gilded Age when wealth inequality approaches historical extremes, when billionaires launch private space programs while working people struggle to afford housing, when corporations pay effective tax rates of zero while Public infrastructure crumbles, when political power correlates almost perfectly with economic power, when the language of meritocracy and innovation obscures the same old patterns of exploitation and extraction. The question is whether we're going to learn anything from this history or whether we're doomed to repeat it endlessly, building new castles while the world outside the gates grows more desperate, telling ourselves that this time it's different, that contemporary wealth is legitimate in ways that Gould's wasn't, that today's billionaires are visionaries rather than thieves, that the market has somehow become fair and meritocratic despite all evidence to the contrary, that we can preserve these massive inequalities without social consequences, that walls and gates and private security will be enough to protect the fortunate from the justifiable anger of everyone else. And if there's hope to be found in Lyndhurst's story, it's in the fact that the estate did eventually pass into public hands, that what was once a private fortress is now accessible to everyone, that the narratives about it have evolved from pure celebration towards something more critical and honest, that we can stand in these halls and ask hard questions about the costs of the beauty surrounding us, that we can use this castle to teach rather than just to admire, that we can make it a mirror that shows us ourselves rather than just a window into a vanished past, because history isn't really about the past at all, it's about the present, about understanding how we got to where we are, about learning to see the structures that shape our lives, about recognizing that what feels natural and inevitable is actually contingent and constructed, that different choices were possible then and different choices are possible now, that castles are built by human decisions and can be dismantled by human decisions, that fortunes are made through specific legal and economic arrangements that could be arranged differently, that the Gothic towers of Lyndhurst casting their shadows across the Hudson Valley are beautiful and terrible all at once, monuments to human ambition and human cruelty, to genius and greed, to the heights we can reach and the depths to which we can sink, and that walking through them with eyes open to both the light and the shadows is perhaps the closest we can come to understanding the country we live in, the wealth we worship, and the costs we're still paying for decisions made by men like Jay Gould more than a century ago in rooms that smell of old wood and money and secrets that no amount of time can quite wash away.